Hello and welcome to Unit 6 of Introduction to Psychology, where we'll be discussing the topic of learning. Now, learning is a systematic, relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. Now, there are different schools of thought in the School of Psychology that speaks to learning, and for the purpose of this unit and this course, we'll be focusing on behaviorism. And behaviorism is a theory of learning that focuses solely on observable behaviors, discounting the importance of such mental activity as thinking, wishing, hoping. So behaviorism is basically the perspective which we'll be using for this lecture as it pertains to how is it that we learn. Now, there are two types of learning which we will discuss. The first type is associative learning, and the second is observational learning. Associative learning is learning that occurs when we make a connection or an association between two events. Specifically, we'll be discussing classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And observational learning, where we learn occurs when a person observes and imitates another's behavior. The first and famous one is the type of associative learning known as classical conditioning, and it is by the theorist Ivan Pavlov. Now, he's a major theorist in the development of classical conditioning, as he was a Russian scientist trained in biology. So I would like for you to pay close attention to classical conditioning, because there are some terms that are a bit of a mouthful. However, once we put it into practice and we match it up with an example, hopefully it all comes together. Also, there will probably be a discussion board about this particular theory. So fret not, there are different ways and avenues in which we will learn this concept. Classical conditioning is the learning process in which a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a meaningful one and acquires the capacity to elicit a similar response. Like I said, classical conditioning is a bit of a mouthful, but you'll realize that we are all victims of classical conditioning in a lot of ways. There are certain terms that we need to get familiar with before we dive fully into classical conditioning. The first one is that of unconditional stimulus, or the UCS. It's a stimulus that produces a response without prior learning. So, for example, a loud bang frightening you. You know that doesn't require much learning. You just naturally react to that stimulus. So it's unconditioned, meaning that there's no kind of training or conditioning. This is just that's a natural thing that elicits a response. You have unconditioned response, which is the UCR, and it's an unrelated reaction that is automatically elicited by the unconditioned response. So with the same example of a loud bang, your reaction of being frightened and jumping is your unconditioned response. Nobody has to teach you how to be frightened or react to that sudden loud bang. You have a conditioned stimulus, or the CS, and it's a previously neutral stimulus that eventually elicits a conditioned response after being paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Again, once we get into it, you'll fully understand what a conditioned stimulus is. Similarly, the conditioned response is the learned response to the conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus pairing. So this is a very basic outline of how behavior is learned through classical conditioning. Before conditioning, you have the unconditioned stimulus eliciting an unconditioned response. Therefore, also there's a neutral stimulus which elicits no response. When you put this whole line together during the conditioning process of a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, it results in an unconditioned response. This process would be repeated, and eventually just having a conditioned stimulus, which is what this now becomes, the neutral stimulus now transforms into the conditioned stimulus, and it elicits a conditioned response. So this unconditioned response now becomes a conditioned one. The famous example that Ivan Pavlov used was that of a dog and a bell. In this instance, the unconditioned stimulus is food, and the dog, smelling the food, naturally salivates, and that's his unconditioned response. When a bell was rung, which is a neutral stimulus, it gave no reaction. A bell is just a bell to a dog. It doesn't mean anything. Now, what Ivan Pavlov did on a daily basis is every day at a particular time, he would ring the bell and then serve the food. So he paired the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and ringing the bell, which is a neutral stimulus. And eventually, what happened is, when the bell was rung, the dog starts to salivate because he now paired the bell with the food, eliciting the response of salivation. And it's just like us when we're growing up, going to school. I don't know if you were exposed to a bell ringing to indicate lunchtime. So once you hear the bell ring, you automatically start feeling hungry. It didn't happen that way the first day of school, but day after day, pairing the two together, after a while, you'll find that a bell means food. Right? And it's a similar thing with classical conditioning. Some additional terms we have to bear in mind when we talk about classical conditioning is acquisition. It's the initial learning of the connection between unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus when these two stimuli are paired. You also have generalization, which is the tendency of a new stimulus that is similar to that of the original conditioned stimulus to elicit a response that is similar to the conditioned response. And then there's also discrimination, which is the process of learning to respond to certain stimuli and not others. So, for example, going back to the classic example of Ivan Pavlov's dog and bell with the food, generalization would mean that if the dog heard any kind of bell, whether it is the bell from a phone or the bell from a whistle or any kind of bell, he would associate that with food. So every time he heard any kind of bell, the dog would now think that it's food time. That's generalization. While discrimination would mean that being able to discern that it's at this particular type of bell when it is rung determines that it's food time. So you're able to discern between the different types of sounds. Extinction is something where the weakening of the conditioned response when the unconditional stimulus is absent. Again, using the dog and the bell. If after a while the Ivan Pavlov just rang the bell alone and did not serve food, after a while the dog would become to realize that the ringing of the bell no longer means it's food time, and so that behavior becomes extinct. Spontaneous recovery is the process in classical conditioning by which a conditioned response can recur after a time delay without further conditioning. So we have all been out of school for several years now, but if we return to a school setting where the bell rings to indicate that school is over or it's lunchtime, we automatically would know to pack our stuff and head towards the cafeteria to get some food, even though we have not been exposed to that pairing for a long period of time. You also have renewal, which is the recovery of the conditioned response when the organism is placed in a novel context. So again, that example would also be relevant. So you go back to your old school and the smells and everything, now you associate it with that memory and everything comes back to you. Now there are common areas in which classical condition is experienced in everyday life. How is it that the most common fear is that of croaking lizards? How is it that we became fearful of objects or animals? Clearly our mother taught us. We see where she saw a lizard, and initially us seeing a lizard never did anything for us. It had no response. But seeing our mother scream and run makes us feel fearful. So after a while, seeing her running away from the lizard, eventually even when mommy wasn't there, when you just saw the lizard, you are now conditioned to be fearful of it. Same thing with food aversions. A lot of the times we are averted to foods because of the memories attached to it. Some of us can't eat porridge because every time we think about porridge, we remember how our mother used to beat us to force us to finish eating it or things like that. Similarly with smells, we remember when we were sick one time, a lot of fellows will say that, certain liquors they can't drink anymore because they got drunk on it and got violently ill. So ever since then, They can't stand certain smells and so on. Another theorist for learning is that of B.F. Skinner, and again, it is a form of associative learning, and he speaks to operant conditioning. It's a concept often associated with the psychologist. Now, operant conditioning, also called instrumental conditioning, is a form of associative learning in which the consequences of behavior, the probability of the behavior's occurrence, so it's in sync with each other. Thorndike's law of effect states that behaviors followed by positive outcomes are strengthened and behaviors followed by negative outcomes are weakened. So basically, operant conditioning is like parenting 101. You reward good behavior and you punish poor behavior. That's what operant conditioning is all about. A person performs a particular behavior, who is the operant, and that behavior may be followed either by a reward or a punishment. If a reward follows, the person will likely to repeat the behavior again in the future. If a punishment follows, the person will be less likely to repeat the behavior. Thus, if a behavior is repeatedly rewarded, it may become very frequent, and if it is repeatedly punished, it may become very infrequent or even eliminated. So the main assumption for operant condition is that it relies on the notion that a behavior is likely to be repeated if it is followed by a reward. Now, there are different ways of rewarding behavior. First thing is shaping, rewarding approximations of a desired behavior. So say you are potty training your toddler and you reward them with a sweet every time. Shaping is the process of getting them to the point of being potty trained. So they'll wear diapers and you reward them every time they pull it down to use the bathroom, and they're rewarded for that. Eventually you say, okay, if you go the day with just wearing underwear and not the pampers and you're using the bathroom, that is rewarded, until eventually the child is in underwear full time and is potty training on their own. The process of getting to that desired behavior is known as shaping. Now, reinforcement is the process by which a rewarding stimulus or event following a particular behavior increases the probability that the behavior will happen again. Now, when we talk about these terms, positive and negative reinforcement, I want you to think of it in terms of mathematics, adding and subtracting. Positive reinforcement is adding, okay? So it's an increase in the frequency of a behavior in response to the subsequent presentation of something good. So you give them 10 more minutes of TV because they did their homework first. Negative reinforcement is the removal of something that is unpleasant. So you're subtracting. It's an increase in the frequency of a behavior in response to the subsequent removal of something that is unpleasant. So the reinforcing of the behavior is that mommy doesn't have to lecture you of keeping your place clean. You get less noise, less nagging as the reward, and that reinforces it. So I'm going to keep cleaning up my room because we don't want mommy cuss. That's negative reinforcement. You're removing something in order to reinforce or increase a behavior. Alright, so this is a good example. Here you have the behavior of handing in work on time. The reward, the positive reward is the teacher praises the performance. And of course, the future behavior is increasingly turning in your homework on time. Another one, for negative reinforcement, you turn in your homework on time and the teacher stops criticizing you for late homework. So you increasingly turn in your homework on time. Another concept under operant conditioning is that of punishment, and you do this because you want to decrease the likelihood a behavior will occur. And a similar standpoint is taken here, where we have positive punishment, where you add something unpleasant so that the behavior you want to stop stops. And negative punishment is the removal of something positive given a behavior in order to decrease it. So, for example, positive punishment, the most popular one is a spanking. Negative punishment is taking away of privileges for the behavior to stop. And this line graph basically summarizes what we've been discussing about the concept of operant conditioning.